Imagine a frozen hell. January 1942. Outside Stalingrad. It's 40 degrees below zero. The earth, scarred by craters, littered with scorched metal, is covered in snow that's never truly white. The air is thick, it's made of soot, smoke, and an unbearable, bone-chilling cold. What falls from the sky isn't snow, but ash. The ash of burned cities, the ash of crews incinerated in their tanks, the ash from planes that are falling to this cursed earth by the dozens every single day. And it's in this hell, over the front lines, that they appear. First, just a growing, low drone. Unlike the shrill voices of the Soviet yaks or the familiar whine of the Messerschmitts, this is something new, something heavy and ominous. The pilots of the Soviet fighters, squinting against the blinding sun, peer into the sky and see them. Squat, stocky silhouettes with broad, almost rectangular wings and a huge, disproportionately large engine cowling. They fly in a tight, death-bearing formation. These aren't just new planes. These are emissaries from another world, from the Western Front, where they've already terrorized British Spitfires. These are the Focke-Wulf FW-190. The Fokker, German propaganda calls it a wonder weapon, and for good reason. Just look at it. The twin-row, 14-cylinder radial monster, the BMW 801, develops 1,760 horsepower on its emergency boost setting. It's armed to the teeth, 2 NG 151 20mm cannons, and 2 more NGFF cannons. That's for barrels, spitting out hundreds of kilograms of deadly metal every minute. And its armor. The pilot was protected by an 8mm armored seat back and a 12mm headrest. The engine was encased in a veritable armor jacket. It seemed this wasn't a fighter, but a flying heavy tank. Invulnerable, all-crushing. The very first encounters with the Fokkers in the skies over Stalingrad were a shock for the Soviet pilots. A burst from its cannons would literally tear the light yaks and legs to shreds. A head-on attack against it was suicide. The density of its fire was overwhelming. It seemed the Luftwaffe had once again, as in 1941, seized control of the skies. The German aces, already familiar with the machine from the West, felt in their cockpits if not invulnerable, then certainly in control. But a week passes, then another, a month, and in the reports, in the accounts of Soviet pilots, strange, at first glance, notes begin to appear. Not fear, but rather bewilderment, giving way to confidence. Here's what a pilot from the renowned 18th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, flying the Yak-7B, reported. It's easier to fight the Fokker than the Bf-109G. It doesn't climb away. It just treads water in a horizontal fight. Stop. How can that be? A machine that terrorized the British is easier for our pilots. In that phrase lies the key to the entire subsequent drama. A drama in which German engineering thought, pushed to its absolute limit, collided with Russian ingenuity, the fury of desperation, and the ruthless reality of the Eastern Front. The Germans bet on power and technology. We bet on tactics, mass production, and an incredible ability to learn right in the middle of hell. And this confrontation decided the fate of not just the Fokker, but, I believe, the entire air war in the East. Economics and history. Why the Fokker appeared the way it did. To understand the fate of the FW-190, we need to step back from the battlefield for a second and look at the bigger picture. Germany in 1942 was no longer the Germany of the Blitzkrieg. It was an economy working to the point of exhaustion, suffering from a severe shortage of resources, especially non-ferrous metals and high-quality aviation fuel. The concept of the Fokker wasn't born in a vacuum. The Germans didn't just need a fighter. They needed a universal soldier, a machine that could be an interceptor, a fighter bomber, a ground attack aircraft, and even a reconnaissance plane. Versatility was their god, and Kurt Tank, the genius creator of the FW-190, fulfilled this task brilliantly. He created a platform that was powerful and technological, but everything has its price. Versatility is always a compromise. To carry enormous firepower and heavy armor, you need a powerful engine. A powerful engine means weight. Weight means a loss of maneuverability, especially in the vertical plane. The Germans essentially created a heavyweight, a super heavyweight boxer who could knock out anyone with one punch, but who tired quickly and wasn't too agile. And what about the Soviet Union? Our aviation industry, miraculously evacuated beyond the Urals, operated in a completely different paradigm. The task was simple, almost primitive, to create a mass-produced, simple to manufacture, easy to repair fighter effective at the main combat altitudes from the ground to 4 or 5,000 meters. Our designers, Yakovlev, Levakin, weren't chasing versatility. They were creating specialists. The Yak, light, maneuverable, perfect for close-in dogfighting. The Law, faster, with a more powerful engine. They were made from what was available. Wood, Delta wood, a minimum of strategic materials. This was the response of poverty to wealth, of simplicity to complexity. And, as we will see, in the conditions of the Eastern Front, it worked. The Achilles heel in the beast's heart. The BMW 801 engine. Let's return to our Fokker. Look once more at its fearsome cowling. Beneath it lay not only power, but its greatest weakness, the heart of the plane. The BMW 801 engine had one unique but extremely vulnerable cooling system. To cool the 14 cylinders of the radial engine, the engineers installed a 12-bladed fan behind the propeller. This fan rotated at a mind-boggling speed, 12,000 revolutions per minute. It forced air onto the cylinders, preventing them from overheating. And the consequence? This highly complex system was incredibly fragile. The ring-shaped fairing, the so-called knocker ring, covering the fan, was thin and vulnerable. A single burst from a large-caliber UB machine gun of 12.7 millimeters, fired by our fighter, and this system would fail. A punctured cowling, damaged fan blades, and the engine was starved of cooling. The Fokker pilot would watch as the oil temperature gauge needle went into the red, and within 90 seconds, a minute and a half, his mighty BMW would simply seize up. One burst, and instead of a fearsome predator, you became a sitting duck, gliding down to earth. But that wasn't all. While the Fokker pilot was praying not to take a hit to the engine, our pilots quickly figured out there was an even more vulnerable target. The 520 liters of fuel that fed this engine were stored in tanks, located directly beneath the pilot's cockpit, and these tanks had neither armor protection nor protector. The self-sealing layer that would plug holes. The tactic was born instantly and was lethally simple. Attack from below. The Istrebki, as our pilots affectionately called their fighters, learned to approach from the direction of the sun, duck underneath the Fokker, and aim precisely for that fuel tank. A shell from the 20mm Schwack cannon, hitting the tank during an attack from a 2/4 angle from below and to the side, almost guaranteed the transformation of the German fighter into a fireball. It was a terrible land. The pilot often didn't even have time to understand what happened. A flash, all-consuming heat, and a second later, nothing. The statistics speak for themselves. And they are horrifying. Out of every 10 FW-190s shot down, 7 perished in flames. 7 out of 10. Imagine the morale of the pilots. You're sitting in the cockpit, strapped in, and you know that right beneath you are 520 liters of high-octane fuel, protected only by a thin sheet of duralumin. Any burst from below, and you're a torch. This thought drove them mad. It paralyzed their will. The German aces, the veterans, tried to avoid head-on and especially low-side attacks. They lost initiative. Even their famed armor was no panacea. 8 millimeters behind the back, 12 behind the head. Seems decent, right? But our UB aircraft cannon of 12.7 millimeter caliber could penetrate that armor. From a distance of 400 meters, our engineers and gunsmiths did their job. The Germans paid a terrible, inhuman price for their firepower and armor. Tactics versus power. How they decoded the carousel of death. But, my friends, it would be naive to think the Fokker was an easy target. No. Its vulnerability, in some aspects, did not stop it from being a formidable weapon, especially in the hands of a skilled ace. And the Germans, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of their machine, developed specific tactics. They used the FW-190 as heavyweights, flying in tight formations, pairs or groups of four flew close to each other, creating a zone of continuous fire. Their calculation was simple and deadly: to force Soviet fighters into head-on attacks. In a head-on attack, the Fokker was king. Its 6 barrels, remember, 2 NG-151 and 2 NG-FF cannons against the 1 or 2 cannons of a Yak or La gave it a colossal advantage. The chances of our pilots surviving a head-on duel were slim. But by 1943, our pilots, shedding blood in every battle, had learned. They decoded this tactic. They noticed a recurring maneuver. A German pair, leader and wingman. The leader, seeing an attack from a Soviet fighter, would suddenly break sharply into a spin or a steep dive, drawing all the attention to himself. Meanwhile, his wingman, who stayed up high, would gain altitude and from there, in a dive, would pounce on our pilot, who was now focused on chasing the leader. It was a deadly dance, a carousel of death, and there were minds that found an antidote. The response was the so-called double loop. Just think about the brilliantly simple logic of this solution. Not one, but two of our fighters would intercept the German pair, but with a time delay. The first pair of Yak 7 South would boldly go head-on against the leading Fokker, forcing him to perform his standard maneuver, the evasive brake. But the second pair of our fighters would follow with a delay of 15 seconds. Those 15 seconds were key. It was precisely at that moment that the wingman Fokker, thinking he was clever and unnoticed, would climb for his killing strike on the first pair. And that's when he would be caught by the second pair of Yaks. He would find himself in their sights, completely unexpectedly. In the 812th Fighter Aviation Regiment, they practiced these maneuvers until they were automatic, until they were muscle memory. The pilots were confident of one thing. The FW-190, heavy and sluggish, was incapable of sharply changing its plane of maneuver after a dive. While it was trying to turn around, ours were already on its tail. This was a brilliant example of how tactics and teamwork overcome individual power. Altitude, the invisible boundary between life and death. Now let's talk about another fatal miscalculation by the German designers. Altitude. The air war over Russia was fundamentally different from the war over the English Channel. In the West, battles often took place at high altitudes, but on the Eastern Front, the vast majority of air combat occurred at low and medium altitudes, from the ground to 4,000 or 5,000 meters. This is where the ground attack aircraft operated. This is where they provided close support to the infantry. And here a fact, fatal for the Fokker, was revealed. Its BMW 801 engine was magnificent near the ground, but as soon as it climbed above 4,500 meters, it began to choke. Its supercharger, a prototype of a future turbocharger, couldn't cope. Tower dropped catastrophically. Its maximum speed at 6,000 meters was 650 to 680 kilometers per hour, but its rate of climb, its ability to gain altitude quickly, fell off disastrously. Above 4,500 meters, the Fokker lost in rate of climb even to our not-so-new fighters, like the I-185. They were quick to take advantage of this. The air defense regiments, equipped with the high-altitude MiG-3 fighter, were particularly successful against the Fokkers. The MiG-3 wasn't great in a close-in, turning dogfight near the ground, but at altitude it was the true king. Here's just one episode that became textbook. April 26, 1943. A group of 6 MiG-3s from the 12th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment takes off to intercept a group of FW-190s. Our pilots don't engage head-on. They act more cleverly. They lure the Germans, feigning retreat, and draw them up to an altitude of 7,000 meters. For the Fokker pilots, this was a trap. They, accustomed to their might at low altitude, suddenly found their planes becoming sluggish, responding poorly to the controls, and reluctant to climb. And the MiGs felt right at home at this altitude. A slaughter began. The Germans, realizing they were trapped, tried to escape using their favorite tactic, diving. But at such an altitude, they didn't have enough speed reserve for a sharp maneuver. The MiGs, light and swift, caught up with them. The report of that battle coldly, in official language, records, for Fokker shot down. For Iron Corsairs, who just recently seemed invincible, found their end near Oriol. The report of the Air Force Scientific Research Institute drew the line. The FW-190A is a low-altitude fighter. Its element is 2,500 meters above that. It becomes a clumsy target. The verdict was final and not subject to appeal. Maneuver, the trap in the skies, but that's still not all. The Fokker's weak spot was its maneuver, especially in the horizontal plane. And here the engineers ran into the treachery of the laws of physics. Due to the enormous torque of the powerful radial engine, the plane had a pronounced asymmetry in its turns. Simply put, it behaved differently in left and right turns. In a left turn, the FW-190 held its own quite decently, on par with the Yak-9. But as soon as the pilot banked into a right turn, the turning radius increased by 30%. Imagine yourself in the place of the German pilot. In the heat of battle, when every fraction of a second counts, you instinctively try to evade an attack by turning. And if you mistakenly choose a right turn, you're a dead man. The plane became heavy, sluggish. It would describe a huge arc. And at that moment the Soviet fighter could easily jump onto its tail. The pilots of the 291st Fighter Aviation Regiment specifically developed a tactic against this. They would provoke the Fokkers into right turns. They'd first engage them in a left turn, then sharply change direction. The German, acting on autopilot, would bank right, and that was it. The trap was sprung. After to such circles, the yak would be on its tail at a lethal distance of 100 meters. The German aces, especially the experienced ones, knew about this peculiarity and tried to avoid sharp right turns. But this constrained them, robbed them of initiative. They were afraid to make sharp banks, remembering also the vulnerability of their fuel tanks. And in an air battle, he who is afraid has already lost. An attack from below and to the side was especially effective, just as the Fokker was coming out of a turn. In this position, its 5mm armored backrest did not protect either the fuel tanks or the side windows of the cockpit. The pilot was completely defenseless. The Corsair sunset, the transition to ground attack and the agony by 1944. The fate of the Fokker as an air superiority fighter was sealed. The loss ratio spoke for itself. If in 1942 it was roughly 1-1, by the time of the Battle of Kursk it was 1-3 in favor of the USSR. Our pilots had learned how to fight, our planes had become better, and our tactical methods more refined, and the Germans, being pragmatists, found a new use for the Fokker. They began mass converting it into a heavy ground attack aircraft. The FW-190F modifications appeared. They removed some of the cannon armament, but instead hung bombs, non-retractable landing gear for operating from poor airfields, and additional armor plates for protection from anti-aircraft fire. The Fokker became a flying tank, working over ground targets, but in the sky. It increasingly had to deal not with average pilots, but with Soviet Guards regiments, equipped with the newest Law-7 and Yak-3. And here it faced its final judgment. The last act of this drama played out in the skies over Berlin itself in April 1945. On April 17th, a pair of Law-7 south from the legendary 176th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, led by none other than Ivan Kassetov, the top elite ace, destroyed 3 FW-190s in just 4 minutes. The irony was that Kassetov used their own tactics against them. The lead Fokker, trying to escape an attack with a classic break, exposed its unprotected underside. A short burst from two Schwack cannons, and the German fighter turned into a falling fireball. The Germans, it seemed, had forgotten the main commandment of air combat. War in the sky is not about blind power, but about the ability to turn the enemy's strength against himself. The main conclusion: why did the Fokker lose? So, what is the main reason for the defeat of this undoubtedly great machine? I've thought about this for a long time, analyzing documents, memoirs, performance data, and I've come to the conclusion that the key lies not in the metal, not in the thickness of the armor or the caliber of the guns. It lay in the doctrine, in the very philosophy of its use. The Germans bet on versatility and technological superiority. They created a Swiss Army knife, a tool for all occasions, but on the Eastern Front, in its cruel, bloody realities, this turned into an inability to adapt quickly. Their machine was too complex, too expensive, too difficult to repair in field conditions. The Soviet Air Force, however, bet on specialization, mass production, and incredible resilience. Our Yaks and Lavochins were honed for one main task: conducting turning battles at medium altitudes. They were as simple as a hammer, and just as effective. Soviet engineers went the opposite way. They made their machines lighter. Look at the Yak-3. Its weight was 2,650 kilograms compared to the Fokker's 3,980. This lightness gave it phenomenal climb rate and maneuverability. In a close-in fight, in a turn, it was elusive. When, at the end of the war, the Germans finally realized their mistake and released the FW-190D with the Jumo 213 inline engine, which eliminated many of the original model's teething troubles, it was already too late. The sky already belonged entirely to the Yaks and Lavochins. The Reich's industry was in ruins. There was no fuel, and most importantly, there were no longer those cadre, experienced pilots who had been dying over the long 4 years of war. The paradox of history is that an aircraft created to kill Spitfires over the English Channel found its grave in the vast Russian steppes and skies. There, where its main opponent became not so much technology, but the will, skill, and self-sacrifice of ordinary Soviet lads who managed to turn its main advantages, tower, armor, and weaponry, into its very own fatal flaws. Of the 20,000 Fokkers built, 1/3, almost 7,000 machines, were lost on the Eastern Front. These aren't just numbers. This is a monument to German engineering thought that collided with unyielding Russian strength. So that brings our story to an end. I hope it made you think. Think about how technology, tactics, and the human factor intertwine. How one seemingly insignificant detail, be it an engine fan or an asymmetry in a turn, could decide a pilot's fate and the outcome of a battle. This story isn't just about planes. It's about us, about people, about our ability to find a way out in the most hopeless situations. If you found this as fascinating as I did while preparing this material, do one simple thing. Subscribe to the channel, like this video so I know our journey into history was worthwhile. But most importantly, write in the comments what other legendary weapon, tank, plane, or ship do you want to hear a similar deep dive about. Maybe the Tiger versus the T-34, or the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Your opinion is priceless to me. Let's communicate. Let's together preserve the memory of that great and terrible war. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Until we meet again on the air.